Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Giacalone. If you're watching this live on YouTube and Kick, thank you very much. If you're watching this on the replay, I thank you very much also. Tonight we have a really special guest, but before I get into our next guest, I just want to make there's a change of note for this weekend. Instead of my usual Sunday, we are going to do the show on Saturday. I have Carlos Pantoja, who is a retired NYPD crime scene investigator. He was originally scheduled for Sunday, but I forgot I had a baptism to go to. So my wife nearly killed me. You guys have been reading about that in the newspaper. So I had to switch for that. So just remember, the Saturday, we're going to have the show at 2 p.m., not on Sunday. So tonight's guest, I have Tim Pappa. Now, Tim Pappa is a certified former profiler for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Not very many chances we can get to talk to somebody who's actually done this for a living. Pappa joined the FBI in 2008 as a special agent in various investigative roles, including several, I think it was 6 or 7, as a profiler. He helped pioneer and develop, which we're going to talk about tonight, his behavioral content creation in order to help cold case investigators across the country. I just want to thank right now Ashley for providing those gifts for everybody. I really appreciate all the membership. So without any further ado, we're going to introduce Tim Pappa. Tim, thanks for coming on tonight.
No, thanks, Joe. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and this is actually, I'm very excited about this. Like I said in the introduction, there's not many chances you get to speak to a real FBI profiler, right? I know everybody probably thinks, right, it's all Silence of the Lambs, right? I'm sure you got that like a million times, correct?
Yeah, no, it's usually Criminal Minds, right? Which I'm sure it's going to hurt people, but I have to admit I've never watched the show. But Mindhunters on Netflix, that show resonated with me because a lot of that show is focused on these discussions that happen between the profilers and analysts about what might be going on behaviorally with the people they're observing or analyzing, and that was very much like reality. So in that respect, no, we weren't jumping on any planes or knocking down any doors, but those conversations and that study and that rigor, that's a reality for sure. That's part of the experience.
Right. And John Douglas, right, who that's really about, he's the person that actually started the whole BAU at the FBI, right?
Yeah, he's one of those founding members, and there's a number of people over the years that have done instrumental research on that analysis. And I think over time it's just developed as the units have grown. There's been a diversity of cases that we work on, and there's continued to be like a cross collaboration with the different units at Behavioral Analysis Unit, which is how I ended up working on cold cases. That wasn't really my background in the FBI, but that's where I got introduced to it, was working with other units that focus on crimes against children and crimes against adults. That was my introduction to it.
Right. Yeah, we definitely want to talk about your behavioral content creation ideas for cold cases, because that's part of what I used to do for a living in cold cases. And I wish I had the internet back then when I was doing this stuff, but we're going to get into that. But there's a couple of, things I want to discuss, because I know the audience is very interested. I have a number of students of mine that watch the shows, and some of them want to get involved in maybe being a profiler one day. What is some, besides, you have to be a federal agent, right? You have to be an FBI agent before you start that. But what are some of the things, like a course of study? What kind of advice can you give some of the students?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it might be surprising to a lot of people that I don't have the exact figures, but I'd say probably not even half of the certified profiler agents at BAU have backgrounds in psychology. There's very diverse backgrounds. What's important is they train you and certify you in the same way, but they count on the fact that everyone has different experiences and different backgrounds to apply that to their work. I'd say you're never going to go wrong if you continue to look for ways to really enrich your life experiences in your study. If you come to the FBI and you have a background in psychology, of course, that can only help you. But if you don't have that, there's no reason to think you can't walk down that path. My background was more in journalism and communication. And while that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with psychology, it does have a lot to do with behavior. And sure enough, like my study in grad school before the FBI, which is focused on how certain people communicated with certain audiences and how those audiences found them authentic or not, I would apply that, like, right, in a cyber realm, because you'd be looking at someone online, what makes that person authentic. Well, the same kind of things converge here. It still comes down to behavior and psychology, and they train you pretty intensely at BAU, and obviously you get a lot of on the job training and collaboration with your peers, and that really enriches that experience. So there's nothing you can really do that's going to be a detriment to it. Just continue to try and enrich your experiences. I would say the people who seem to thrive as profilers at BAU, and you probably could say this across the board for a lot of places, but especially in BAU, where you do have to keep an open mind with every kind of case that you look at, are people who are willing or able to think outside the box. They're comfortable in those spaces. They're willing to be innovative and consider maybe a different way to analyze what they're seeing. And also they're willing to be pretty serious, right, in scholarship in terms of really understanding the material. Because if you don't understand the material in terms of what's this theory say about this or that, or how can we apply this framework to this kind of behavior, you're not going to understand that enough to communicate that to, say, the state and local and federal agencies that you're working with, who obviously in many cases, like yourself, are going to be experienced detectives, and you might have agents that do not have anywhere near the same experience, right, with homicides, but maybe there's some other way that they can support those efforts. So yeah, enriching, diversifying your experiences, trying to add those degrees and that study wherever you can. I mean, that really is going to be an approach that's going to do you well if you're trying to get to that point. But yeah, most agents who come to the BAU have probably had about 10 years already in the field. So you're experienced by the time you get there. And then once you get there, you're kind of starting a whole new pace, because you're no longer running cases, you're supporting cases, and things are very different. Yeah.
That's interesting. How many profilers are there in the FBI BAU?
It fluctuates. It's never really more than 40. But at times it's gotten as low as like 15 or so. So it's a really small number. And as profilers, they're really counting on that collaboration with all the agencies involved, right? So, we always played a role. I guess we'd say we're kind of like consultants. That's how you should think of us, because we're not going to come in and take your case. We're not going to make decisions for you. We're not going to run your case. But we want to be supportive for everybody involved, but also willing, if our analysis tells us one thing that's at odds with what the investigators think, are we willing to stand behind that? I think that's a lot of the power of behavioral analysis when we're applying that correctly, because it's not necessarily someone's opinion. It's not necessarily someone's gut experience, which that shouldn't be discounted. And it's not always about people's biases. It's a indirect assessment, right? You're using different analytical frameworks to apply to the activity that you're seeing, the behavior you're seeing, to see if it tells you something different. And I think that's why people respect it. They respect the fact that you've taken some analytical rigor, some method, some model, and applied it to that behavior. And it might tell you something different. It's not always definitive, of course, but it contributes to that whole case plan and all those teams. I mean, any big case that you've ever had, involves so many people. And the BAU is really just one part of that. Even if it gets glamorized sometimes on TV, we're just one part that's supporting the efforts of all these investigators.
All right, actually, here Sinead actually asked a pretty good question. It says, when do profilers step into the case, or what are the steps involved? Do you like just come in and say, okay, I'm here, or do you have to get requested? Tell us how that works.
Sure. We're there to support any state and local or federal agency. Within the FBI, there is a system where every field office has a BAU coordinator, and they're supposed to be the intermediary between state and local agencies out wherever that field office is. They typically can send us leads, but a lot of this happens informally or formally, in terms of you might have relationships already at different law enforcement agencies. But what it kind of comes down to is when those investigators decide they want to start that conversation. There's been very few times, I think, that in my experience when I was there, that we've ever turned away a case saying, this isn't really a good fit. I mean, every unit has their own experience with that. But it's typically when investigators and detectives have gotten to a point where They've exhausted a lot of investigative techniques. They've gone through a lot of legal process. Certainly, you probably can say that goes without saying for a cold case, but even things that are relatively recent, if you've hit that point and maybe you're looking for a different perspective or a different take on it, that's often a time that people reach out. And I think that's part of the reason historically the BAU has gotten a lot of people's best and weirdest and toughest cases, because they're looking for a different opinion, a different perspective on it. But certainly there's people early on in investigation, based on the facts, based on the circumstances, they want to reach out because maybe they don't have any kind of offender identified and there's behavior they can't really explain, or there's something very unique about what an offender has done that may or may not be related to something else, but it's odd. It's odd behaviorally. And that's just typically what we're looking for. So I think the nature of the profilers at BAU, the spirit of the profilers at BAU, we never really want to turn away a discussion because we're so interested in the material. And we think if there's a chance to help support and contribute to that investigation, then we want to try and help. I mean, that's the whole reason for us being there.
Right. So is there a single BAU office? Is everybody like in Washington, D.C., or are they scattered throughout the country? How does that work?
Sure. There's 5 units actually. And 4 of those are operational. And by operational, I mean we provide support to cases. So the first one is a unit that does a lot of threat assessments, like things you would see with school shooters or people who are making threats, or maybe something related to terrorism activity. That's one unit. BAU2, which is the unit I was on, actually focuses on cyber and counterintelligence. BAU3 focuses on crimes against children, and BAU4 focuses on crimes against adults. Now, BAU5 is our research arm. So they include researchers, doctoral researchers too, that assist with going through some of the statistics and seeing if there are studies that we can put together. But there's 4 units that make up a handful of profilers on each unit. And yes, everyone's located in Virginia. I think by virtue of things changing in the FBI and then with COVID, things were becoming more virtual anyway. So, it wasn't really a situation where people were always traveling to different field offices. You just had to get used to doing these things remotely. So, that case collaboration often is us having a call with someone who's requested help in some way. We talk through the case with them. They send some materials maybe in advance and we have a chance to look at it. And basically we're trying to find out what is it practically that you're looking for in this case? What are some services we can provide? But also we're exploring too, what else might there be that we can do? It's kind of like a pie in the sky. If you could achieve your pie in the sky goal in this case, what would it be? Because maybe we can find that. And once we have that material, once we have those, clarified objectives that they're asking for, then we go to work on that case. It's a peer review environment. There'll be a lead profiler on each case, but you're going to work together in a team because you want people to take a look at that stuff as well, or work on certain things together. And then the actual delivery of the consult is going to be once we have our analysis. And that could include, say, maybe someone's asking for an interviewing strategy with an offender. Well, we've done the core of that has got to be the behavioral analysis first, based on any information we have from the case, based on anything that might be behavioral that we can reap from that case file, or any other sources of information, because that behavioral analysis informs everything, right? Case strategy, interview strategy, how you might want to talk to them, what might be the next step in the case. So that's really how those things work. And there are certainly relationships with a lot of agencies that just go on for years, and obviously cases, these cold cases, that goes on for years. But it also can be a situation where you help one time, they move on with their case, and that's the last you hear from them. And I think that's a good thing too, right? Because I think keeps us fresh, and I think it keeps us grounded, right? It keeps us grounded because this might be a really important case to them. I might be getting a lot of attention, but it's not our case, and we have a specific role, and we want to help out. And good luck, right? And then they move forward. And again, that's our role. That's how that process works. But it is obviously very fulfilling when, say, someone does use a strategy that's behaviorally informed, and you get this not in that case collaboration with BAU, it's probably just not going to go very well. I mean, I guess you could say that's critical anywhere you work, but given the fact that you've got people looking through your case file, you've got people who appear to just be, offering their opinion on your case file. Some people don't take it that well. So it's also going back to that question about people who want to become profilers or people who might thrive in that space. Do you have a thick skin, and are you willing to constructively communicate effectively with people when it's really you're talking about their case? This is something they probably invested years of their life into, and they have things on the line, but we don't. So there's a lot of that environment at play as much as we're spending time on the actual case and that behavior. It's also very important that we're aware of the relationship with the agency that we're working with.
So I got a question here from Rachela Pranzo. So there are many women profilers in the FBI?
I don't know numbers specifically, but certainly like in my class when I came in, we had 3 women and it was 50-50, and 3 men, including myself. It just depends. Like I said, I don't know the exact figures, but there's certainly at least a quarter, if not more, of the profilers at BAU are female agents.
Okay, that's great because when you think about, the ratio, that's still pretty high in regards to probably
Sure.
between agents and then that kind of thing. So yeah, as I'm trying to watch the chat and see what kind of good questions coming. Everyone's talking about Mindhunter. Somebody says a real life Mindhunter, right? So so listen, I mean, there's a lot of big cases going on right now. I know that you're involved in one. We're going to talk about things generally because it's an ongoing case, but the case of Rachel Moren. There is a link, folks. If you're just joining us now, we're up to 120 people watching this live. If you're just joining us now, Tim Pappa, former profiler for the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, all his links are in the show notes, including a link to an article he wrote for Uncovered.com, which is on there, and also his new YouTube page, Storytellers. And we're going to get into the Storytellers. We're going to get into what Tim does. One of the things that you're doing now, you're working on the Rachel Moren case. And for those that don't know, this was the woman that was sexually assaulted and murdered on a path in Maryland, correct?
Mm.
And, so you're working on it and you're doing this behavioral content with the family. Tell us a little bit how you got involved with that, if you can. I know it's an ongoing case,
Sure.
so you don't want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was very fortunate that there's a number of people out there in the true crime community and people who advocate for victims and advocate for victims' families, who I started talking to when I was transitioning out of the FBI into the private sector, and I was starting Storytellers as well, who were sharing some of their experiences as families or advocates for victims' families, what their experience with law enforcement has been, which, I have limited things I can point to with that. But if I look back on my experience, it's always been not at arm's length, but situations where I'm supporting that law enforcement agency. Maybe I'm flying in for a week or a couple of days to do filming and meeting with some members of the family. Maybe there are people in the family who are persons of interest. It kind of runs the gamut, but I haven't necessarily just worked with victims' families before. And so I think, yeah, there's a different perspectives out there, but just hearing from them that for a lot of them, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get information from their perspective. I understand certainly in a lot of investigations, there's just things you can't share with the public or the family because it's critical to that investigation, and there's nothing malicious about it. It's just the course of investigations and preserving things legally. But I hadn't really had that experience, and I think as I was trying to think through and conceptualize, well, what Storyteller is going to be and how do I want to use this now that I'm going to be outside the FBI? I had the opportunity to meet on a phone call a member of Rachel Moren's family, her brother, actually, Michael Moren, and the father of Rachel's oldest daughter, Mac McMahon. And we had a great conversation about essentially what it is I think I could do to help out. But this really kind of came down to they're obviously looking for justice in the case of Rachel's murder. They're looking for anybody who have information, and again, without overstepping my place, this was very different for me because no longer was I say a member of the law enforcement community. I wasn't representing BAU, so I don't necessarily have any kind of relationships at all with the sheriff's office up there. And I can't force my way in. It's just got to be something like, hey, if there's a way I can help, I will. But the family was looking for any way that I might be able to help. And what I thought at the time was, well, what really drives people to respond to, say, your story, especially if you look at, say, the market out there, I'll call it the market of cold cases. There's so many. Unfortunately, there's so many families that have lost people. There's so many cold cases out there with victims, and I'm sure any family that's lost someone to a homicide or a missing person feels equally for other families who have lost. But one of your purposes, of course, is to try and get attention on your family's case. And so, in that respect, a lot of the work I was doing while I was at BAU with cold cases is really focused on how can we prioritize the attention of the right audience in this case so we can drive behavior with it, right? Because sometimes it's about, hey, you want to raise awareness publicly. Sometimes you want to get a message to an unknown offender or a known offender. Instead of this being about just like getting more of the same content out, let's show a different side of this family. Like, you can never, of course, communicate the feeling that a family has with the loss that they've suffered. But what I've seen in my research before the FBI, what I've seen in cases that I've worked on in the FBI, whenever I've started to develop this idea of behavioral content creation, is anytime people have a chance to see and feel someone else's pain and their story, and all they're seeing is someone being vulnerable there and being genuine, people really respond to that. So maybe instead of another news story each day about another missing person or another person who was killed, if there's an opportunity to take some kind of thin slice or some piece of that person's life and share it with people publicly so they have a chance to connect with it, that tends to drive people. It tends to make people respond. And you can do a whole lot with that. And that was really all I was proposing with the Moren family is, hey, there's no script in this particular case because I wasn't working with that law enforcement agency. It was just the family. We're like, let's just show a different side of you guys. Let's just share a little bit of who you are. That's all it's got to be. And, I would have anticipated, of course, that this was going to be still intense for them, emotional for them, more than I can even imagine, right? In terms of what they've been going through in the past few months. And so when I'm having a conversation with someone, that's all it is. And these kind of filmed interviews, if you want to call it that, instead of say something with a lot of lights and cameras in a formal studio or in a police interview room, it's just a conversation in a place that has a lot of emotional value for them. So it's going to be questions from me like, hey, do you ever dream about Rachel? Can you still hear her voice? Tell me about the best moment you ever had with Rachel in your lifetime as her brother. Those kind of things, people start drawing on very emotional memories. Because if you didn't know Rachel Moren's family and you just met her brother, those are probably the stories he would share with you, and people really respond to that. And I just don't see a lot of that content out there. The face of the media for a lot of law enforcement, understandably, is going to be press conferences, press releases, short news items with an executive in a police agency, or maybe a grieving family member. But a lot of that stuff, I think, gets lost in this sea of very similar content. What I'm doing is looking at what we've seen for years in consumer psychology and marketing of what people really respond to. People are looking for very genuine emotional content because even if they haven't experienced that themselves, there's probably something about that person that they can't connect with. Again, that's what we're looking for. It's kind of like, how do you get people in a town with a missing kid to look for that kid, but you've got to get them invested. I think if people have looked at some of this work on influence and persuasion, a really well-known researcher is Robert Cialdini, and he talks about this idea of social proof and social consensus. A lot of people are probably familiar with that, right? It's like whenever you're not really sure what to do in certain environments or moments, you kind of look to other people to see what you should do. It's the same reason why if you're driving down the highway and you see a car on the side of the road, someone's in there, you're not sure if they're okay, but you seeing everybody else drive by that car, you're probably going to drive by that car too. What Robert Cialdini discovered is when he was in a car accident, the way you get people to respond is you look directly at them and give them some kind of objective. You, I need you to call 911. You, I need you to go check on that car. People respond to that, and they've continued to do numerous studies on what causes people to actually respond. We're taking a lot of those psychological principles and applying them to media online. But that was the initial approach of me trying to explain some of the methodology and approaching this as humbly as I could in terms of I know this is going to be difficult for them, but can you share your story a little bit more? Can we go back to places that I know are very difficult for you? And people responded once that content was put together. Now imagine a situation where it's even more focused, where you have people who are suspects or identified, and you want to try and drive some kind of behavior or attitude shift and say the people in their life, like their family members or their friends. That's when we can really get much more effective with how we kind of channel this behaviorally based content. But that's as simple as it started. The family was very gracious. They were open to any help that someone could provide to them. And that's where I had an opportunity to make this content for them.
So here you go. Stacy says you have a beautiful temperament and
you,
approachable personality for families.
Thank you.
No, it's important. It's important, right? Because of what you do. Because if you haven't watched these videos, I said the link is in the story from the storytellers. It's in the show notes. These are short, powerful clips. I mean, bringing the family to the crime scene, though. How did that all come about? Was that a difficult idea to come across? Like, we're going to actually take you to where the crime scene happened?
It was really just a pretty open-ended discussion with Rachel Moren's brother. I mean, a lot of this is, there's a lot of parallels to, say, motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing comes from people like Ron Fisher in the 80s and others who were looking for a way with primarily addicts to kind of guide them in a conversation, in an interview, in a treatment program that they feel like they're actually driving, right? But you're actually guiding them through it. It's very open-ended. It's very conversational. It's very exploratory. The kind of engagement we're looking for as well in these kind of situations was the same way. Like, what are you comfortable with, Matt? Right? Like and he started sharing with me that sometimes he would go down to the tunnel. And so in that respect, I thought, okay, this is a place of emotional value for him. I talked about it in the article about it's a persuasive geography, and a persuasive geography is a principle of influence too, called place attachment, is actually not about, say, like the landscape. It's about the relationships you had there. And that's why people who move to other towns and other countries, why those places often have value for them was the people and the relationships they had there. Well, same thing is happening in these places. So I've been in cases that I've worked on where I've asked someone I wanted to interview to, let's go to the site of the body dump, even if that body dump was 20 years ago. And even if I don't know if this person had a hand in it, for all I know, they dragged the body up there. I don't know, right? But regardless, this is going to be an emotionally rich place for them because they know the body was found there. They can imagine all the things that happened there. So once you go there as your starting point, it's almost like you have a stage. You've already kind of changed the whole environment and feel for the place. So it was open-ended, and I don't have to go into all these explanations of like what technique is being used or what model this is. This is more about like, I want to bring the audience to where he is, right? That's what it really comes down to. Like, people are watching a lot of content. They're consuming a lot of content. They're not going to watch for long. Can you bring the audience somewhere they wouldn't ordinarily get to go? No one probably had a chance to go into that tunnel with him. And what they told me was that the prior news reports on the tunnel, they had been at the wrong tunnel, whoever was like saying where she was found. So to actually be in the actual tunnel that Rachel was found in, that impacts me too, right? Because you're thinking about what happened there. And all I got to do in that situation for the video with Matt, where it is pretty dark, and of course I'm thinking about all these things like lighting and audio, and are people going to be able to see him, and what's the quality of the film going to be? But even in that process of like getting that stuff ready, I can already see it. I can already see he's going to another place emotionally. And he was very worried about even knowing what he wanted to say. I wasn't worried about it because he's talking about his sister and he's talking about the pain he feels. And that's all people want to hear. That might even resonate with this unknown offender out there, or the family of this unknown offender, much more than somebody saying, "You're a monster, you're a killer, we're going to find you." I don't think people respond to that. I don't think killers respond to that, right? But there's a human element in all of us, and so when I approach those kind of things, I'm thinking about aesthetics. I'm thinking about what might look good to viewers, but the real quality and meat of that story is going to come down to, can we keep this open-ended? Can we keep them comfortable? And can I just let them tell their story and share whatever they want to share? So in a lot of these videos, I might actually be talking to them on camera for like 45 minutes, but then we make a video that's 90 seconds because I'm looking for like the right timing with that. Yes, I got to think about all these aspects of, is the audio good here? How's the lighting look? Is this too grainy? Because I've seen the research, and we can draw on our own experiences too, but the research that says, hey, people are kind of forgiving for the quality of footage, but they are not very forgiving for bad audio. So it's like I'm thinking about all those things. Is the mic working? But at the same time, I just want them to tell that story. So all these things go into it, and I often have like technical issues for sure. I've just been,
welcome to the club.
yeah. So I've been fortunate that we have a PCR. I mean, the Matt Moren video, there's probably another 10 minutes of him sharing some pretty dark stuff, and I say dark only, not that it's not normal, but in relation to what people might expect to hear on camera, right? They might expect to see something like someone on a national news channel making an appeal and tell us about Rachel. Rachel was this and Rachel was that. That's fine. And people often expect to see that. But if you really want to surprise people's expectations, people want to hear that very personal stuff because either they've never heard it before or they're looking for content like that because they want to feel for a second what this is actually like. Even if they don't have any information of value, that stuff's really important. And I can't even overestimate the value it has on investigations, even in stuff that you can't really measure. Like a lot of these cases over the years, I had to start rethinking what's the measure of success in these cases. It actually wasn't how many tips or leads came in after these videos aired. That's great, but you can't always count on that. It turned into something very different. Like, what about the relationship between this family and that law enforcement agency? What about the way a lot of people in this town think of this family and if they think they were involved, right? So that's why you have situations like, for example, a past series on a missing teenager named Carla Guse. I did a 12 video series, that's a lot of videos, short videos, but it's a lot. But the whole idea was I wanted to bring depth to this family so people might see them a little bit differently, regardless of what they thought in terms of like who is culpable or not or what really happened. So there's one, to give you an example of this, there's one video in particular that's actually of her stepbrother. And, this stepbrother isn't mentioned in anything. You're not going to find him. He's not going to be in other national news. But through the family, they had suggested, what about him too? And he's willing to do it. Okay. And there wasn't a lot of planning. It was like we came to his house. He was home from school. I think he was 14. And we just started talking to him outside and filming. And he had this ridiculous story, but it was an important story to him about the last good memory he had of Carly. And it was like a silly story about he had his shirt off and he was like being silly, pressing against her, and he was all clammy. And it was a silly story, but that's the thing. Like, people remember those things. I had a creative writing teacher in college who told me, don't write about a guy smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee in a diner, because we've seen it 1,000 times. We have that image in our head 1,000 times. If you write into your story, it's actually an octopus in a 3-piece suit drinking coffee and smoking a cigarette, people won't forget that. So I'm looking for those kind of stories and moments where people are really being genuine. Again, there's not ulterior motives there in terms of like scripting anything. It's just showing people being real. So they have a moment to kind of take in this person in this case and maybe ways they can help.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating when you think about it. And something else that you said earlier, and actually in the article too, you're not just doing this for the family per se, but you're actually talking to the potential suspects in the case, which is actually a really unique idea. And like you said before, it's not about, we're going to get you, and when we find you, we're going to bury you under the prison when we get you.
Yeah.
It's an interesting aspect of that. Has there been any like luck, so to speak, with that kind of stuff? Because I mean, listen,
Yeah.
we know when we deal with a lot of unknowns, right? So
Sure.
sometimes luck does have a play in it, but if you're hitting the right strings,
that's difficult to answer. I mean, a lot of it, I think, because a lot of those cases are ongoing.
Okay.
What I think is most helpful about it is it introduces more narratives out there that everyone can use, right? Especially investigators, because there is going to be narratives that an offender or offenders are going to respond to. There have been past cases that the whole idea was like, hey, how do we reach this specific audience of people we know about and people we don't know about, hoping that they'll come forward, because creating some kind of communication strategy or strategic messaging plan, if you're just trying to get people to think and feel things, that doesn't have a lot of value. It's got to be behavior. Your objective has got to be aligned to, you want them to do something, right? So in a lot of these cases, even people you wouldn't expect to come forward, if you craft the right message, really keeping in mind that person's self-concept, even someone's self-concept in a group, like why does someone join a particular kind of group? Well, there could be a lot of reasons, and they may not be reasons that resonate with me, but they resonate with other people. So if they hear a message from someone like them, someone that sounds like them, someone that talks like them, that has a lot of power. There's been things that have been a little bit more conceptual, that I've explored and developed, but it kind of comes down to this point. Like, if you have someone who used to be a member of an extremist group and they represented that extremist group in a leadership role, and maybe they went to prison and they're out and they're reformed and they're claiming they're reformed, how are they going to connect with people in that same group? Most people aren't going to accept them, right? Because then, like, you're a sellout. You cooperated. You looked out for your own skin. You have no credibility, even if you used to be a part of this group. Well, in one respect, a way to connect with people in that extremist group is to appeal to things you're not going to have conflict on, right? So maybe it's less about a discussion, say, with an extremist group about right and wrong, or is this ideology right or not? What are some other areas you probably can connect with? Love, family, hope, loss. Those are things that people can connect with. An aspect of this that has more of a science-based approach is, it's called narrative persuasion. And that's a lot of what's happening here in some of this behavioral content creation. And narrative persuasion's been around for a long time, and marketing uses it all the time. But it basically says that instead of appealing to logic, right? Logic of, here are the pros and cons of this. This is why you should do this, or it's the right thing to do. This is why you should come forward. That's more of a logic-based appeal. The narrative persuasion takes someone and it tells a story. And it can be written, it can be video, but it tells a story, and that's entertaining the people. And people tend to scrutinize that less, right? And that actually tends to resonate with people. So when you're watching there are a lot of commercials like this during COVID where a lot of corporations wanted to show people what they were doing to make people's lives better during COVID. And typically it was taking stories of individual people, whether it was real or not, whether it's fictional or not, and giving you a short introduction to their life for a moment where they get to experience like something that happened to them, something that was good that happened to them. And people really respond to stories. And that's what we're trying to do. Like there's a lot of messaging you can do to a lot of people in a case if it's in story form. The part that's a little more difficult to talk about because it's just more sensitive is how behavioral content creation supports investigations, right? Like we see the public facing aspect of this. We can talk about the families and how it impacts them. We can talk about how audiences respond to it. But truly, at the end of the day, this is also an investigative technique because to have the opportunity to really get deeply ingrained with families and other people in communities where you really have attention there. You know that maybe in that city, the killer is in that city. They've got suspects, they've got persons of interest. That may not be public, but if the law enforcement agency knows that, you can really craft what you want to message in that regard, right? It's literally coming down to having a private discussion with someone, right? If you know that there are people in the life of that offender that really motivate them, it could be people they love, it could be people they hate. That's why we want to know that stuff. That's why BAU wants to know that stuff, right? They want to know whoever is the target of that communication, whoever the audience is, what kind of groups do they have? What kind of relationships do they have? Because that's who really moves people in their life. If you think about decisions you've made in your life that are really important, whether it's good or bad, often part of that discussion or part of that decision has involved family members and very close friends because it impacts them too. So many respects, although every case is different, I think you really have to think about that in terms of how you message an unknown offender or a known offender. I touched on it briefly in the article, and it's not about tearing down other people doing analysis. I had issue with a flyer that was put out there about who this killer was, right? Sure, I objected a little bit to the language that was used, but a lot that's coming from a background at the BAU where I'm applying methodology to how we do this analysis. So if I'm going to make certain claims about an unknown offender, how do I even know that to be able to start ascribing personality characteristics? I think in the article I wrote about who's really the intended audience here, it's somebody who knows him, and they're probably not in Maryland. They're probably in California where they think this guy is from. But that stuff's important. The people that you're counting on to come forward, the people that you're counting on to share information about this person, they probably have a relationship with him. So that's a hard step. I'm not speaking from experience other than what I've observed in cases. It's a hard step for someone to take to start looking at their friend or their family member as a killer, as a rapist, whatever it might be. All these terms that are ascribed to them as monsters and so forth. Even in an interview with that offender, that's not going to work with them. They're not going to respond to it. So that's why communication and how we craft that content is so important.
Yeah, it's a whole collection of things, right? And so not only getting information out there for the public, but it's for law enforcement. Tiffany has a good comment. She says it's basically like a call to action via an emotional connection, right? Is that something that you can agree with?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, in my last few years at BAU, there was a big push from one of my colleagues who's also recently retired, Cameron Malin, that maybe we weren't talking about emotion and affect enough. Maybe we didn't understand it enough. There's an article I read one time that was an ethnography of like female surfers in the UK. And this researcher was also a female surfer. So she spent 2 years with them, surfing with them, spending time with them. And what she realized as she was doing her analysis and writing up her research was that she never really considered the emotion and affect that she experienced when she was with them and that they were experiencing. She couldn't really measure it. And so we started to look at these cases in every aspect of the case, the actual act, the behaviors, the engagement, the interview. And obviously you can't separate it. Emotion and affect is part of all of that. And if you look at some of the research on affect and information processing, what they're really talking about is it literally colors everything we do. How we judge people and things, how we process information, even simple studies that have been done in the past where they took a group of college students, and one group they showed them a very positive video, and another group they showed them a negative video. Then they did interviews with them separately, and they found that significantly, overwhelmingly, the group that watched the positive video was much more open to discussion, much more creative, much more open to collaborating. And they saw the reverse in the other group significantly, that they weren't very open to this. So how people are feeling and affect plays a huge role in this. Yes, not only in how people respond to content, but the people you're trying to message and the people you're trying to interact with, that also has a huge role. And it's something that before I left, we just didn't explore enough. I'm sure there are situations with it anecdotally, but I just didn't come across a lot of examples of investigators and detectives actually starting their interview, whether it's custodial or not, with content that they showed to someone they were interviewing to try and induce an emotional response from them. Because if you can induce an emotional response that's positive, they're probably much more willing to talk to you, and they're less likely to scrutinize the things that you're communicating. I mean, I'm generalizing too, but I haven't really seen this play out much. I'm sure there are examples, but yeah, definitely emotion and affect are critical to every part of this.
So we got a great question here from Shannon. She was wondering how validating it must be when a profiler identifies many correct aspects of the person who is found guilty, right? So I'm assuming it's a good feeling.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but the truth is we got to give a lot of credit to the empirical research that was done before that. A lot of scholars are kind of working in theory. They're doing research, structured studies, focusing on advancing that theory, and they don't always get to see a lot of application of that theory, but we often do. And it's actually just as validating to see when it doesn't work, and you have a chance to understand why it didn't work. And if it goes back to that theory and that research that could explain why this happened, that is validating, because I think it's another chance to learn from it. But yes, it is validating in a respect when you see that, just like we thought, based on this behavior, they responded that way. But we definitely can't get lost in that. I think, we would caveat every piece of profiling that we would do of, this isn't definitive. This is just based on the data or information that I've had access to for this period of time. So in that respect, that's what we try to stand on. I think there's, maybe not for, say, the true crime community, but more generally, I think some people out there might have different views or more historical views of profiling. That's a lot of people sitting around and guessing and imagining who the offender is, or it's a guy who lives with his mom in his basement or something like
Drives
that.
a Volkswagen.
Yeah, right.
Drives a Volkswagen, like they used to say all the time, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, so if you look at a lot of the more historical consults that were done in like these older files, a lot of them are wrong. That's why this approach is very comprehensive. It's as dynamic as possible. You're going to have statistical analysis you can apply to. You're going to have inductive and deductive analysis. And then you're going to have all these theoretical frameworks that form what you would call an analytical framework for your behavioral analysis that might start informing on this. They're really just starting points. So if you're going back to that base of, say, victimology, what's that relationship between the victim and the offender? That's going to inform a lot on who we're probably looking for and what the capabilities were of that person. I mean, you see it on enough shows, or people who are investigators have seen it in their cases. It's like, yes, we probably can say that this missing child who's 2 years old, that it's very possible family members had something to do with the disappearance of this child, because she's 2 and she doesn't have a social network and she doesn't have means of travel, and she's only so mobile on her own. And those are starting points of those are probably true. We don't know, but it's something to consider. But they still have to engage with that family in terms of your child was taken or your child is missing, and we're going to help you find your child, even if there's a possibility you're dealing with the offender right there. But that's a dynamic, comprehensive approach to behavioral analysis that I think maybe a lot of people don't know, or it's more of a historical approach, but that's what's really being applied in these cases. And I think, again, going back to my point of, I think a lot of people respect that because it has a different voice when you're informing planning and preparation in cases than just a lot of people with different opinions and different experiences in the same room who are trying to agree on something, being able to actually point to something. But to that point, I think is another example of this technique of creating behavioral content and filming and investigations, that it's such an untapped resource. One of the last cases that I worked on before I transitioned out of the FBI was a cold case of a missing teenager out west. And on one of these evenings, I went and filmed the parents in that case. And it was really interesting when I came back to the field office. And this was a case where you had a lot of members of the local police department also involved in that case. And unlike, which is usually the norm, which is you've got, say, 2 detectives or an agent and detective go out and interview someone. They come back, they share highlights. Some people talk about it, some people don't. They write up the report. People can read it in the case file, maybe not. So you've got fragments of case information in all these different places. There's actually a bias related to that called information pooling bias. And all that's really saying is that even if people have very unique marginal information, they tend not to share it. They tend to share the information that everyone's already kind of talking about. So that's one fascinating thing. But what I'm concerned about is how things get lost, right? Things that aren't written up in a report, things that are kind of on the cutting room floor. But being able to come back to the field office and just play the raw footage for 40 minutes of this interview with these parents, and you've got 40 investigators and analysts in that room all watching the raw footage. So I haven't edited anything. I haven't turned this into a 90-second video. And you've got, at the end of it, all these people in the room saw all these different things, right? Because they're just taking notes on certain things they noticed. Now that really enriches an investigation. So even if you take that piece of it, there's so many opportunities for application of this as an investigative technique, which is very hard to promote and sell when you're kind of outside law enforcement now and you're trying to offer that or provide that to the law enforcement community. That's a little difficult to navigate, understandably.
Well, you have a couple of people that want to be your future agents, because we have a couple. We had Deb and we have Andrea who said that you need to write a book, right? So this is so we everyone hopes you're working on that, because as I'm listening to it, first of all, it's fascinating, and a lot of people are saying the same thing, because I could just listen to you for hours because you have that kind of voice that just kind of lulls you in. But no, not only can law enforcement use this, but I think a lot of lessons here for the true crime community that are doing some things out there. Some of them, let's put it this way, borderline unethical, but some things a lot of people can learn from this in that respect. And listen, Tim, you're going to become a very busy man in the near future. I'm telling you, because this resonates with me, because I used to do this for a living, right? I used to, do it, and we didn't have this kind of capability back then. And when you think about it, the media needs to catch up on this too. So just be prepared. Your email's about to blow up, I think, over the next few months.
Well, no, I really appreciate you having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Well, as you said, and I think we're going to see a lot more of you on TV and other locations too, because this message needs to get out here. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, there's so many cases, there's so many things, like you said. We have a few minutes left, but let's. I don't know if you've been following the Long Island serial killer case out. Dealing that with the 10 bodies and the Rex Sherman guy.
Mm.
We already have a suspect in certain other cases, but how, I mean, you have a serial case. How can your method, because we're not just talking about one family, right? We're talking about several families. Where how would you go about doing something, like that, and taking on a big case
Sure. Well, I
in
think,
general?
it kind of starts with what's the objective of the investigators, right? Like maybe they want to focus on, if they don't know who he is, if there's a way to attract him somewhere online or offline, something that he's probably going to be interested in. Can you create events, right? I think that's one way to think about it. If as a detective, I'm sure you would think in advance about interviews you're going to have with people, that not that it's theatrics, but there's some aspect of that. So if a killer is killing people in a particular kind of way and they want attention for something, well, maybe you can appeal to that, right? When we're talking about like someone's self concept, one of the most important pieces of that is their idealized self, the person they aspire to be. And even for someone who might be a psychopath, we still know obviously they're driven by negative emotions. They're still going to be responsive to that. There's still going to be things that arouse them, that make them angry, or whatever it might be. And so if there's an opportunity to put that that kind of content in front of them, or to make that part of your engagement, if there's reason to believe that they're very vested and interested in what each of these victims' families is talking about, is there a possibility that there's going to be an event and he's going to show up? There might be, right? I'm speaking very generally here, but certainly there's an aspect of fame to this, that they want to be known for the things that they've done, even if they deny it endlessly once they've been caught. And I think there's opportunity to appeal to that. I think there's a little bit of a nuance there. It's not about praising them, it's about speaking to them like you know them. You're speaking to who they want to be known for, right? You're speaking to the person they aspire to be. It's kind of like, if someone can, deduce that I want to be thought of as some kind of scholar. Well, maybe if they speak to me that way and they give me opportunities to demonstrate that, or they, give me compliments in terms of like, it'd be great if you were teaching this class at this university. I'm probably not going to scrutinize them as much. I'm probably going to like them more. I'm going to trust them more. Someone we would call a serial killer is not going to be that much different. But this also goes back to victimology. So if you look at the victims and you point out certain things, like they had a particular kind of victim, okay, maybe it's sex workers, but maybe there's racial overtones of something, like they didn't like biracial people and they focused on biracial victims. Well, if there's an opportunity to communicate a message out there that's going back to a family and highlighting or promoting the fact that the person he killed was biracial, and this was actually a very harmonious family, this was a great family, and this woman that maybe some people were going to tear down and say, oh, she was a sex worker, she did this and that. Well, there's all these other great qualities, and she played such a role in this family's life. Is that the kind of content and message that's going to cause that killer to respond negatively? Yeah, it might. Because when people respond and start to have that emotional and cognitive response, sometimes we call that a cognitive or emotional overload. And when people are in a state of that overload, they tend to make mistakes. They tend not to think through things as much as they could. They tend to not notice certain things happening in front of them. And that's often a situation you want to be in. So maybe there's some kind of engagement online. Maybe it's just an aspect of an interview or an engagement in that respect, where they're looking for an opportunity to be the person they aspire to be. So there's a lot of elements to that. So I think that's what you do. You look at the victimology of these victims, you look at some of the behaviors, and you try to craft content, especially from victims' families, because that's probably where that person's still looking. Even if we look at some more traditional models, like of people revisiting crime scenes or keeping trophies, that stuff is still pretty vibrant. People are still doing that. So if those things have value to people, we're talking about emotional value to them. We're talking about there's a hierarchy there of emotional arousal and maybe other arousal. Well, draw on that. You want to draw on those same kind of artifacts in content and narratives, right? That's how you start to channel people's attention. If you can start to channel their attention and hold it, now you kind of have a stage to communicate with them directly. Now you might have a stage to engage them directly. Now you have a stage potentially to intersect with them. There's a lot of possibilities there. I know I'm speaking about that very generally, but it's a very general approach at first, where even if you don't even know if this person's alive, you don't even know who it is, but you look at the victims. And generally, that's a starting place of what really causes them to respond behaviorally. Because it's the same kind of things, right? In terms of like, why did they select that person? If I look at, say, a small public library in Tennessee that was defaced, their website was defaced with the ISIS flag, that's victimology. That's a starting point for us to maybe suggest whoever did this may not be pro-ISIS. They might be, but they probably wish they would have defaced the Pentagon's website, but they probably couldn't do it. They're probably not skillful enough. And in terms of victimology, this website was vulnerable. It was available. This may not be what they desire, but it is vulnerable and available. And so if that's the case, now you have a victim pool and a type of victim that they tend to focus on. And again, that might be your starting point of where they're probably going to be, where they're probably looking, what they're searching for. I think you could apply that to all these cases, probably including the Long Island serial killer case.
Yeah, I wish you were able to talk to the Suffolk County Police way back when they were dealing with these victims, because they handled them very badly. I
Wow.
mean, yeah, a lot of things that happened there. I mean, your compassion shows through in a lot of different things, because victims are victims no matter what kind of situation they were involved with. And sometimes, law enforcement forgets about that. They don't do that. And a lot of the public discounts that too. So, Tim, listen, I could talk to you all night. I mean, this could go on forever. So, I mean, we don't want to do that to you, because I promise you, I don't want to take up more of your time. But I hope to have you back on in a future date for sure,
Yeah.
because everybody is saying that they just enjoy hearing your stories and your level of expertise. Like I said, you should be thinking about some training videos for law enforcement, for interview interrogation. Listen, like I said, I have a couple people here in the chat that want to be your agent. So just keep going with this stuff. I'm gonna try to push as much stuff out there as I can. I think that you're going to become, like I said before, you're going to become a very busy man in the near future. Is there anything that you wanted that we maybe didn't touch on today that you wanted to get out, or if there's something else that you wanted to let people know about what you're doing and or where to find you?
No, I think maybe one thing. I think as I've transitioned out of the FBI and I'm starting to build up storytellers, I think there's an aspect of still trying to figure out, like, what is this going to be? I know a major part of it, of course, is I want to apply these same methodologies that I was developing when I was at BAU, but I want to be as open as I can to different experiences here. And my point early on about the perspective of families and what they're going through, that's something that's a little newer for me. And so I'm very open to exploring that and trying to figure that out, because maybe the first road isn't, down with law enforcement agencies. Maybe it's with families. So I'm very open to still trying to craft, like, what is storytellers going to be. But at the end of the day, what I'm looking for is an opportunity to contribute in some way to cases that actually makes a difference, and to families. I think one thing that the final thing I'll say about it, I guess, is with the Moren family, and I wrote a little bit about this in the Uncovered article, but it's just not something I necessarily thought about before when I was with BAU, because much of my work related to cold cases was their investigation objectives, and I'm trying to develop this craft and put together this product and help other investigators accomplish this and that. And because you have situations where sometimes the family members are persons of interest. So considering all that, with the Moren family, there is a different pace to it. It was a different pace in terms of getting to see how just talking about this with them and actually creating the videos seemed to be part of their process of making meaning from all this and their sense making. And I'm saying this again as someone who personally has not experienced loss in my family or extended family to a homicide or a missing persons case. So I don't know that level of pain and loss, but being there with them, even briefly like that, and making a product that I'm trying to share with people a little bit from their lives, but I'm not them, but they still respond to them. Like those stories were really fulfilling for me to hear. And I sometimes didn't really even consider that just making these videos, even though this is just one period of time in their healing process and trying to manage their grief, it actually impacts them quite a bit. And maybe something that I really underestimated through a number of years of doing this is how this impacts the family and the relationship with law enforcement, because the consistent narrative is they're looking for help, they're looking for information. And I think a lot of families often feel like they're not getting information, they're not getting help. And I would say probably a majority of the time, investigators are not doing that maliciously, but they've got so many cases to handle, so many cases they handle, especially cold case teams. But there's a different thing here that even at the end of the day, if this doesn't result in more leads, if this doesn't help solve the case, does it bring some peace to the family in some regard? That's still fulfilling. And maybe that's going to be part of my purpose with storytellers. But I just say that to say I'm not leading into this with any kind of expectation of like, this and this has to happen. We all know like these things can go on a long time. But if it's a chance to make some kind of difference, I think that's what drives most of the people in BAU as well. People, I've gotten this question a lot, and I'm not even a profiler who dealt with a lot of, gore and things like that compared to some of the other profilers, and certainly not to the level that, experienced detectives like yourself have seen. But I'd get this question of like, how do you deal with that content and how do you deal with dealing with that stuff? And what I usually say is like most people are very focused on let's just do whatever we can to help solve this. And if I have an opportunity to help bring justice in this case, that's all I see. These stories definitely sit with me. They hit me at different times. They do. It's just whenever I'm like working on these things, my main focus is, can we get out a product that actually does something? And that's what drives me. So again, I appreciate the opportunity from any family to do that. And I appreciate the time being on your show, Joe, to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's great. Your empathy shows through, and that's what's going to make you successful in this. So I can tell you right now, big things coming for you, Tim. Listen, everybody, thanks for joining us tonight. We had a great time. Tim Pappa, thank you very much too. Everyone, good night, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
All right, thanks.